What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. How Nancy Reagan used astrology in the White House. Of Ronald Reagan. U.S. presidents and first ladies must often make important decisions. A White House staffer's 1988 memoir alleged that Nancy and Ronald Reagan used astrology in making many of these decisions. Though decades have passed since the Reagan administration, it is mystifying how the former leader of America used the location of the stars and planets to inform decisions that impacted millions of citizens. This only adds to the plethora of weird facts about Ronald and Nancy Reagan. When Ronald and Nancy met and got married in the 1950s, they were both working as actors in Hollywood. They held a lifelong interest in astrology, which had a more respected reputation at the time. In 1966, the people of California elected Ronald as governor. Astrology, on the other hand, did not become a more significant part of the Reagans' lives until Ronald Reagan became president and escaped an attempted assassination attempt in 1981. With the help of astrologers like Joan Quigley, Nancy helped her husband run the country for 2 terms, using the positions of the stars and planets for executive scheduling and planning. Though there was public backlash regarding Nancy's fascination with astrology, many continue to remember her as one of the most beloved first ladies in U.S. history. After her husband's near assassination, Nancy often sought astrological advice. Nancy met astrologer Joan Quigley in the 1970s after Quigley made frequent appearances on the Merv Griffin show. Program host Griffin knew the Reagans had an interest in astrology and introduced the 2 women. For the next few years, Quigley read President Reagan's charts, but it wasn't until 1981 that Nancy needed her help. John Hinckley Jr. attempted to kill Ronald by shooting him outside the Washington Hilton on March 30, 1981. Though the president had narrowly survived, Nancy suffered anxiety and unease throughout much of her life after the incident. She began to rely on Quigley's astrological advice and took a more active role in her husband's presidency following the shooting. Historian Lou Cannon points out that seeking control through astrology likely helped Nancy deal with the traumatic incident, which many people had expected her to overcome more easily. She kept a color-coded calendar based on astrological predictions. Nancy built a color-coded calendar to help her and her husband plan their schedules around astrological predictions. The calendar utilized the colors of a traffic light. Green meant the day's events would unfold smoothly. Yellow suggested they should exercise caution, and red signaled the predictions for that day did not look good. Nancy also included notes for her husband each day according to the predicted color. She sometimes instructed the president not to leave the house on days when predictions appeared unfavorable. Nancy often adjusted the timing of events to coincide with auspicious astrological predictions. She kept Joan Quigley on retainer for consultations. According to reports, after Ronald's near assassination, Nancy decided to keep astrologer Joan Quigley on retainer to consult her as needed. Though she had much faith in astrology, Nancy allegedly felt embarrassed about hiring an astrologer and kept the agreement a secret. Nancy paid Quigley $3,000 per month from her private funds and through a third party to keep the deal under wraps. Consultations between Nancy and Quigley always took place over the telephone, never in person. Sometimes the 2 women discussed astrology and scheduling several times a day. Though Quigley knew Ronald's chart well, she did not know him personally. In fact, Quigley claimed she had only met President Reagan once while in the receiving line for a state dinner in 1985. She used astrology to help schedule travel and speeches. According to Joan Quigley, Nancy sought her astrological advice for almost every matter regarding the president's schedule. In a tell-all book released in 1990, Quigley claimed the Reagans consulted her to predict the best times for Air Force One flights, especially takeoffs and landings. Quigley reportedly planned all trips for the Reagans, including day trips and travels abroad for both diplomacy and pleasure. She also claimed responsibility for timing most of Ronald's speeches, including the State of the Union and various press conferences. Scheduling debates also allegedly fell under Quigley's jurisdiction. She claimed Nancy consulted her regarding the best time for Ronald to debate Walter Mondale and Jimmy Carter. The Philadelphia Inquirer once reported that Ronald had signed a nuclear missile treaty with the former Soviet Union at a specific time determined by an astrologer. Astrologers chose Ronald's inauguration times according to his chart. Before taking office as governor of California in 1967, Ronald had scheduled his swearing-in ceremony for 12:10 a.m., 9 minutes after his term was to begin officially. Some considered this an odd choice of time, and rumors started to emerge about the Reagans consulting astrologers for decision-making. Ronald refused to discuss his belief in superstition amid speculation that astrological predictions had altered the schedule. Instead, he claimed that the timing would enable him to watch a crucial football game later that day. Despite this claim, he then rescheduled his swearing-in ceremony for 12:01 a.m. Ronald also allegedly timed his presidential re-election campaign's announcement to coincide with favorable astrological conditions. After he won, Ronald planned his second inauguration to take place 50 seconds past 11:56 a.m., supposedly on his astrologer's advice. Nancy's astrologer may have helped end the Cold War. As Ronald Reagan became U.S. president in 1981, the country was enduring Cold War tension with the Soviet Union. Supporting strong anti-communist ideals, Ronald viewed the Soviets as a corrupt empire. He bolstered America's military power, preferring intimidation and physical threats over negotiation. It wasn't until 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power as the Soviet leader that Ronald softened his position. According to Joan Quigley's sister, the astrologer played a large part in changing Ronald's mind. Quigley allegedly had a long talk with Nancy, who relayed to her husband Quigley's advice that he shouldn't view the Soviet Union in such black and white terms. The story claims Quigley created an astrological chart for Gorbachev after learning his birth date. She compared it to Ronald's chart and firmly believed the two leaders had compatibility which would allow them to work together and end the Cold War. Nancy allegedly used this information to convince Ronald to begin talks with the Soviet Union. Quigley's sister also believed Quigley helped plan the Reykjavik summit by instructing Ronald to stay as long as he could, despite his frustration with the process. The summit was successful, and the leaders began a treaty that eventually led to the Cold War's end. The Reagans consulted famous Hollywood astrologer Carol Reiter for years. In the 1950s, when Nancy and Ronald first met as actors in Hollywood, astrologers didn't have the fringe reputation they hold today. Frequently seen at parties consulting celebrities, some astrologers had gained the respect of the public. Carol Reiter was one of the most famous astrologers working in Hollywood at the time and had stars like Cary Grant and Marlene Dietrich as clients. Nancy met Reiter in the 50s and quickly became a frequent client, as did Ronald several years before he met Nancy. The Reagans continued to consult Reiter for astrological advice throughout Ronald's political career. Reiter allegedly influenced the chosen time for Ronald's 1967 swearing-in as governor. Reiter also reportedly advised Nancy that Ronald should hold off on running for president. As astrology grew less and less accepted by society, Nancy supposedly became embarrassed about seeking advice, often visiting Reiter using her maiden name while hiding her face with sunglasses and a headscarf. Joan Quigley allegedly helped improve Nancy's image as First Lady. Many often expected First Ladies to stay up to date with home and clothing fashions, and Nancy tried to follow suit. Though she attempted to emulate Jackie Kennedy upon entering the White House, America wanted something different. Nancy's attempts to remain en vogue, such as when she purchased new presidential dinnerware, didn't sit well with a country struggling through a recession. Nancy reportedly tried to change her public image in order to better connect with Americans, according to Joan Quigley's advice. Quigley instructed Nancy to avoid photo shoots for fashion magazines and instead to create the perception that she was of the people. Thus, Nancy became involved in various volunteer activities. Nancy's Just Say No anti-drug campaign became one of her most memorable contributions to Ronald's presidency. Until 1988, Nancy kept her astrological practices a secret. Ronald and Nancy Reagan never made it public knowledge that they had sought the advice of astrologers in order to safeguard their status as revered political figures. In 1965, Ronald wrote about his daily habit of checking his horoscope and noted his friendship with astrologer Carol Reiter. But it wasn't until former White House Treasury Secretary Donald Reagan published his memoir when the extent of the Reagans' interest in astrology emerged. Reagan alleged in his 1988 book, For the Record, that the Reagans relied heavily on astrologers. Though the book didn't name Joan Quigley, it mentioned a female astrologer in San Francisco, which pointed to Quigley. Eventually, Quigley confessed that Nancy frequently requested her astrological skills and claimed she would never accept political clients again. The Reagans denied using astrology to make decisions. Once Donald Reagan's book publicized claims about the Reagan administration and its reliance on astrology, the Reagans suffered a backlash. Nancy especially felt affected by the claims, as people believed she was mostly responsible for bringing unconventional tactics into the White House. Ronald asserted, "No policy or decision in my mind has ever been influenced by astrology." Ronald also explained his wife's interest in astrology as a response to the assassination attempt, calling the incident a trauma that didn't go away easily. Nancy added to her husband's dismissal of the claims in My Turn, her book which debuted a year later, writing, "While astrology was a factor in determining Ronnie's schedule, it was never the only one, and no political decision was ever based on it." Ronald Reagan refused to deny that he believed in astrology, despite the Reagans' assertion that they did not use it for decision-making. He once said, "I've not tied my life by it, but I won't answer the question the other way because I don't know enough about it to say, is there something to it or not?" Numerous supporters are outraged by claims about the Reagans' belief in astrology. Donald Reagan's tell-all book angered Reagan supporters who believed the president had consulted astrologers for executive decisions. Though the Reagans brushed off the claims, arguing that the allegations served as a distraction from politics, some people questioned the efficacy of an administration ruled by superstition. When asked if he felt concerned about the potential damage to his reputation, Ronald said he felt more concern for the author's reputation. The Reagans' affiliation with astrology prompted several cover stories by major magazines, such as Time and People. Even reporter Ted Koppel covered the story on Nightline. Several politicians spoke out against Ronald, including Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, who noted, "I hope the nation's destiny beginning in January 1989 will be based on something other than horoscopes." Many members of Ronald's administration refused to believe the claims, including presidential aide Lynn Nofziger, who jokingly pointed out, "If he's been consulting astrologers, he's been getting some bum advice. Who told him to make the arms for hostages deal with the Iranians?" Ronald reportedly held other superstitious beliefs. According to reports, Ronald once claimed his lucky number was 33 and sometimes joked that Abraham Lincoln's spirit was still a White House resident. In addition, Ronald supposedly refused to tell anyone except a trusted few his exact time of birth. Astrologers use birth times to determine the precise locations of the planets and stars in a particular position, which comprises the client's charts. Ronald may have feared the information would fall into the wrong hands, allowing people with suspect intentions to take advantage of his chart and control him. Joan Quigley was astonished by Ronald's chart, and she assisted with his presidential campaign. Astrologer Joan Quigley knew Ronald would make an impact on the world when she read his chart. "He had the most brilliant horoscope I'd ever seen in this country in this century. His sun is in the mid-heaven, which is the part of the United States horoscope that rules the president." Though Quigley gave guidance to Reagan during his unsuccessful attempt to secure the Republican presidential nomination in the 60s, she had a feeling he wouldn't win. However, when Nancy contacted her in 1980 to recheck her husband's prospects, Quigley read political opponent Jimmy Carter's chart and knew Ronald stood a favorable chance of winning. She joined his campaign, beginning a long relationship as Nancy's astrologer. While Ronald did win the election, he received his first public criticism regarding his interest in astrology. The Federation of American Scientists voiced their concern about a world leader making decisions based on astrology, a study which the group considered fictitious. Nancy likely wasn't the only First Lady with unconventional beliefs. Numerous First Ladies held beliefs in cosmic forces and otherworldly ideas. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis reportedly took an interest in the I Ching, a Chinese divination system based on numbers that could allegedly predict the future with better accuracy than astrology. Some claim she channeled her and her husband's Celtic heritage and threw rune stones, another method of divination using marked stones to assist with decision-making. The story of how Nancy Reagan used astrology in Ronald Reagan's White House is both fascinating and perplexing. It brings Hollywood superstition into the highest office in the United States and raises questions that historians, skeptics, and political analysts alike continue to be astonished by. As U.S. presidents and first ladies are entrusted with decisions that affect millions, it is particularly striking to learn that some of those decisions may have been influenced not by political advisors or intelligence briefings but by planetary alignments and the advice of astrologers. In his 1988 memoir For the Record, former White House Chief of Staff Donald Reagan claimed that an astrologer on Nancy Reagan's orders cleared virtually every major decision during Reagan's presidency. This was the most prominent source that revealed this unusual dynamic. While astrology today occupies a fringe position in American culture, its presence in the Reagan White House was both pervasive and highly guarded. In the middle of the 20th century, astrology was enjoying a wave of mainstream popularity, particularly in California, where mysticism and alternative spirituality had begun to merge with celebrity culture. Both Ronald and Nancy Reagan were former actors who had developed an interest in astrology long before entering politics. In the 1950s, when Ronald was still an actor and a General Electric spokesperson, he started working with astrologer Carol Reiter. This set the stage for what would become an unusual but crucial part of his political life. When Ronald was elected governor of California in 1966, Reiter allegedly helped determine the exact time of his swearing-in ceremony, set bizarrely at 12:10 a.m., raising eyebrows and giving rise to rumors that the Reagans placed stock in celestial influence. Still, it wasn't until Ronald Reagan narrowly survived an assassination attempt on March 30, 1981, that astrology shifted from a background interest to a full-fledged operational filter through which many White House decisions were made. Nancy was traumatized by the incident, and as a result, she became extremely concerned about threats in the future and feared for her husband's safety. Seeking solace and control, she turned to astrology as a means of navigating a dangerous world she could not otherwise manage, a fact noted by Reagan biographer Lou Cannon, who explained that astrology offered Nancy a psychological anchor in a time of extreme uncertainty. This need led her to re-engage with astrologer Joan Quigley, whom she had met in the 1970s through television host Merv Griffin. Griffin knew of the Reagans' long-standing interest in astrology and introduced Nancy to Quigley, who soon became a regular consultant. After the assassination attempt, Nancy began to consult Quigley not casually but systematically, keeping her on a retainer of $3,000 per month, paid through third parties to maintain discretion. Despite her deep reliance on Quigley's insights, Nancy rarely met with her in person. Instead, the two women talked a lot on the phone, sometimes multiple times a day, about how the president's movements could be predicted by star charts, good times, and cosmic conditions. Quigley never knew Ronald Reagan personally, though she read his chart extensively and allegedly only met him once, during the receiving line of a formal dinner in 1985. According to Quigley and later Reagan, Nancy used these consultations to construct a color-coded calendar for the president's daily schedule, borrowing the familiar red-yellow-green system of traffic lights. Green meant it was a good day for public appearances and major decisions, yellow signified caution, and red days were to be avoided altogether. On red days, Nancy would sometimes cancel or delay trips, press briefings, or even official signings, all based on Quigley's readings. These astrological recommendations extended into virtually every arena of White House activity. Air Force One flights were timed to avoid unfavorable celestial conditions. Speeches, including critical ones like the State of the Union, were scheduled during astrologically auspicious windows. Even the historic 1987 signing of the INF Treaty with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, a landmark in ending the Cold War, was said to have been timed in accordance with astrological advice. Quigley herself later claimed responsibility for timing presidential debates, suggesting that she influenced the schedule for Ronald's face-offs against Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale, selecting moments when the stars were aligned for clarity and charisma. These revelations, while astonishing, were largely kept from the public during Reagan's presidency. The inner circle of White House aides reportedly found Nancy's astrological insistence frustrating and bizarre, and some, including Donald Reagan, saw it as a hindrance to governance. In fact, Reagan's eventual resignation in 1987 was reportedly triggered in part by Nancy's interference and micromanagement, especially her insistence on astrological consultations. Astrology appeared to be involved in larger geopolitical decisions in addition to daily scheduling. According to Quigley's sister, the astrologer helped nudge Ronald Reagan toward a more conciliatory approach to the Soviet Union. After mapping out Gorbachev's astrological chart and comparing it to Ronald's, Quigley became convinced the two leaders had potential compatibility. She urged Nancy to persuade Ronald that their shared energies could bring about progress. This influence allegedly contributed to Reagan's more moderate tone and willingness to negotiate, first in Geneva in 1985 and later at the pivotal Reykjavik summit in 1986. At the Reykjavik meeting, Ronald initially stormed out in frustration, but according to the same source, Quigley had previously advised Nancy to encourage him to stay as long as it takes. He returned, and the summit ended up paving the way for the 1987 Arms Reduction Agreement. Though the influence of astrology on foreign policy seems far-fetched, it is a documented aspect of the Reagan White House's inner workings. The Reagans' reliance on astrology had roots not only in their post-assassination trauma but in a long-standing pattern. In Hollywood, astrology wasn't fringe, it was chic. Carol Reiter, the astrologer to the stars, was a household name among celebrities. He counted Cary Grant, Marlene Dietrich, and other Hollywood elites among his clients. Both Nancy and Ronald had consulted him for years before entering politics. Nancy even took pains to obscure her visits, sometimes using her maiden name and donning dark glasses and scarves to avoid being recognized. When Reiter advised against a presidential run in the 1970s, the Reagans listened, at least temporarily. But as astrology became less socially acceptable and more associated with New Age fringe beliefs, Nancy began to conceal her beliefs more rigorously. Still behind the scenes, astrology continued to shape key moments. Ronald's re-election campaign in 1984 was allegedly launched at a time chosen by Quigley, and his second inauguration was scheduled at exactly 11:56 a.m., an oddly specific time some believe was astrologically ordained. The secrecy surrounding these decisions only deepened the mystery and controversy. While Ronald Reagan never publicly confirmed his belief in astrology, he did make vague comments suggesting an openness to a higher power and joked about being a Taurus.